Hello everyone, this is MMA Sherdog for the Bluff the Spot High Stakes course. In this video I'm going to cover out of position play from the big blind. This is an extremely important video because you're going to play out of the big blind extremely often, and it's very difficult to play out of position with a weak and capped range. So it's very easy to make mistakes. We start off pre-flop. The first pointer when defending the big blind, make sure to avoid offsuit dominated hands. Hands like Queen 8 offsuit, 9-6 offsuit, Ace Deuce offsuit, etc. These hands play very badly out of position, they have massive reverse implied odds, and when you do hit your hand is often so good that you will not get any action. So hands like, for instance, 8-5 suited play much better because you can make a flush as well as a straight using both cards, and your hand is much less dominated than, let's say, an ace. It's also important to 3-bet a depolarized range. You cannot only 3-bet big cards because then when the board is medium cards, you're capped to an overpair, and also when the board is big cards, you will not have any bluffs. And you want to keep your 3-bet frequency up so that in position doesn't realize too much equity by seeing too many flops. When playing short stacked, high card hands go up in value, hands like, let's say, King 10 offsuit, but hands like 5-4 suited and low pocket pairs go down in value because those are hands that want to draw to the nuts and then make the pot very big. A hand like King 10 offsuit has a lot of immediate equity. Things turn around when playing deep stacked. Hands like 5-4 suited and pocket pairs go way up in value, as well as suited aces and suited kings, and the less playable offsuit hands again go down in value. You also have to make sure to mind the rake. The lower you play, the higher the rake, which means that we still keep our 3-bet frequency up, because if you 3-bet and get a fold, you pay no rake, but if you call, you do pay rake. So mostly the calling range tightens up once you play lower stakes. And those ranges are significantly different than the ones you'll play at higher stakes. For instance, at 25.50 on PokerStars, you pay around 0.8 big blinds, whereas on NO100, you play, I think, around 8 big blinds. So that's 10 times as much rake. The last pointer is to play tight multi-way. You should again avoid all of these offsuit dominated hands. So if, let's say, under the gun opens and button flat calls, you should definitely aim to fold hands like, let's say, A6 offsuit, because your opponent's aces are going to be better. You can make a flush using both cards, you cannot make a straight using both cards, and if the board is a dry ace high, it's very obvious that you have an ace, so it's not as if hands like pocket queens are gonna pay off multiple streets. So even when you do hit your hand, you're not going to win a lot of money. And when you call the flop and then he bets the turn, you're already got a pretty weak bluff catcher, which with almost no outs to improve. We go more in depth into pre-flop play in the Bluff the Spot pre-flop Bible. On to the flop. First off, don't donk the flop. We could talk about this for about 1 hour if we like, but long story short, don't donk the flop. On almost every board, solvers do not recommend donking, and even on the ones it does, it's usually at a somewhat low frequency, and it's very easy to mess this up and make big mistakes. So even if in theory it makes you a little bit of money, if you play a great strategy badly, it's still going to lose you money to playing an almost perfect strategy well by just checking. So that's easy, right? Because you don't have to spend any work on that. It will also ruin your sim outputs, because even if you wanted to lead, most of your opponents don't. So the tree would be changed and it would be more difficult to study it. You're going to encounter lots of high frequency betting strategies by villains, against which we have to check raise a depolarized range. So in a minute we're going into Pile Solver to look at some different examples. When your opponent c-bets a wide range, we respond with a wide and depolarized check raise. If your opponent bets a very polarized range, generally for large sizing, you can start check raising far less. That's usually on the boards that are not as good for your range. Third point is to not overfold versus small bets. On the dry boards on which both players often have nothing, you have to be loose with hands like ace, king, and queen high, and even some of the 3 flush, 3 straight hands. Remember, you're getting really good pot odds to call, and you can still win the pot on later streets you can also get lots of value, you can bluff him off a better hand, etc. So be careful not to overfold. And adjustments to villain are very important. Everybody plays a different strategy when it comes to c-betting, so of course you cannot use the same strategy when playing against different opponents. Most people tend to c-bet their full range on boards like ace-3 deuce, but on, let's say, boards like queen 8-6 flush draw, some people bet third pot with their range, some people bet big, some people use a combination of bet sizes, so it would make very little sense to use the exact same counter strategy against 3 different strategies. Let's go into Pile Solver and look at some different out of position plays. First board, king 4-3 rainbow. We've checked 100%. In position has bet 100%. In the in position play video, you'll see that this board gets c-bet at a near 100% frequency, so we recommend just c-betting your full range. That's also what the vast majority of regs do anyway, so I think that your out of position response is going to be very accurate. So how do we combat that? You'll see that we're check raising at a very high frequency, almost 23%. So this is one of those boards that nobody really hits. The king is obviously good for in position, better than for out of position, but the 4 and the 3 don't really hit either player. Sure, we have a few of them, but really not many. And even if you have a 4 or 3, it's not that great of a hand. So you'll see that most of our range is just medium cards that miss this board. Same goes for in position. So he's going to c-bet at a high frequency, and we check raise often. And you also see we're only folding around 37-38%. And that's usually with these middling hands, the in-between hands with no backdoor draws. So let's first look at check raising. Which hands are we check raising? You'll see here that the better the top pair, the more we check raise. So with top pair no kicker, king 8, we check raise sometimes. And then the better our kicker here, king queen, we're check raising over half the time even. The same goes for some of the suited kings. King 4 and 3, king 3 are obvious raises, as well as hands like 4-3 and our sets. So since we're check raising at a high frequency, we also check raise the top of our range at a high frequency, obviously. If it's a spot in which you don't want to do much raising at all, you can start calling some of these 2 pair hands. We also check raise some of our 4 and 3x. So you see a hand like ace 4, for instance, gets check raised. We dominate hands like ace high that bet call the flop, and in position has to bet call this flop with a lot of ace highs. But then the weaker 4x generally don't get raised unless you have good backdoors to go with them. A hand like 5-4 suited gets raised sometimes, more often than a hand like jack 4. So those hands are similar in hand strength, but we have better backdoors. So we can check raise a lot of these mergey hands for protection and potentially turn them into a bluff on later streets when this is near the bottom of our range, and it'll look like we have almost no bluffs. You also see that we're check raising most of our premium draws. So hands like, let's say 6-5, we're check raising, 7-5, etc. So mostly the low showdown value hands with decent equity. We're also check raising some ace highs here, hands like ace 5 for instance, as well as ace deuce. So we're just check raising them for protection, basically, to not let villain realize too much equity in position, and then we sometimes turn them into a bluff on later streets. So what about check calling? We're mostly check calling with the better aces. So you see right here, the better aces get check called always. We have a better kicker, but no backdoor straight draw. We only check call with the better aces. They have a better kicker and no backdoor straight draw or actual straight draw, whereas the lower ones, as you see, do get raised. And then we check raise some of the 3 straight, 3 flush hands as well. For instance, a hand like 8-6 suited gets check raised sometimes. So it's a little bit too weak to call, given that we only have 8 high. But we have 2 overcards to the 4, a backdoor straight draw, and a backdoor flush draw. And when, let's say, the turn is something like a 5, it will look like a lot of our obvious draws have hit some showdown value, and then it's a nice hand to turn into a bluff. We're also check calling some of the 3 flush 3 straight hands, like let's say Queen 9 suited. These have enough high card value and backdoors to be check calling, but not enough bluffing potential later streets to be check raising, unless they're low card hands which get check raised a bit more often, like let's say Jack 5 suited. So overall, in position C bets a lot, out of position check raises a lot, and also doesn't fold much. So let's pick another board. 8-5 deuce rainbow, a somewhat blank board that is, if anything, a little bit better for out of position, because out of position is going to improve to a pair slightly more often than in position. But at the same time, the 5 and the deuce are low cards that out of position doesn't hit too often. And the board is also somewhat disconnected. So there's just mostly gut shots present, and then some of the suited straight draws. So you see, when we pick a half pot sizing, in position C bets a lot. So how do we respond to that as out of position? We check raise somewhat often. So you see right here, since in position bets only half pot at a fairly decent frequency, we again check raise at a fairly decent frequency as well, almost 15%, and we again don't fold that much. So let's look at how this board is similar to the other board. So you see right here, top pair with a good kicker gets check raised quite often. And then when you go down in kickers, it gets check raised a bit less often. That's similar to what we saw with the pair of kings on King 4-3. And then we're sometimes check raising as well with some of our second pairs with backdoors. So you see, for instance, hands like 5-4 suited, they get check raised, as well as obviously our nutted hands. So if we do have a hand like 8-5 suited, pocket 5s, pocket deuces, pocket 8s, they get check raised, since we're check raising at a high frequency. This board is a little bit different because we have a lot more actual draws. On King 4-3, we had very few. So you'll see that a decent amount of draws do get check raised. 6-7 gets check raised. Hands like 9-7. So basically the low showdown value hands with pretty good equity. Surprisingly, 4-3 suited does not get check raised. And then we check raise some of the slightly weaker draws at a lower frequency. So a hand like 6-3 only has a gut shot, which is not to the nuts. So we check raise a bit less frequently than a hand like 6-7, which is to the nuts, and it has more pair potential. Against a slightly larger bet size at a slightly lower frequency, we can be a bit tighter with our ace highs. So you see, ace 7 and ace 6 don't get called anymore, but obviously we still continue with hands like ace 4, ace 3, ace deuce. And you see again that the ace highs with gut shots sometimes get check raised. And you'll see that we check raise some of the good backdoors, hands like 10-7 suited for instance, overcard, backdoor straight draw, backdoor flush draw, only 10 high. So if you get a fold with this hand, that is really beneficial. Getting a fold with a hand like ace jack doesn't really help you because you probably just have the best hand. So you benefit a lot more from getting a fold with a low card hand than a high card hand. What are we check calling? Well, most of our medium strength hands were check calling, as well as the better aces, and then some of the better showdown value hands. So you see, for instance, a hand like king queen has some showdown value, has somewhat clean pair outs, but not the best backdoors, so we tend to just check all those. So you see once again that mostly these middling hands with no backdoors get check folded. So let's look at a board which is very good for out of position, 7-6-5. You'll see that in position does not c-bet a board like this very often. I think that most villains c-bet this board way more than around 32%, so we should respond by being a little bit overly aggressive. So what are we doing on this board? We are check calling at a fairly high frequency as well as check raising. That makes a lot of sense because this board is just very good for us. It's hard for us not to have much equity on this board. So you see once again we're check raising most of our strongest hands. We have 8-9 offsuit in our range here pre-flop, which villain may not have. We have a lot of the offsuit 2 pairs, straights, etc. We can check raise again with some of the weaker showdown value draws. such as, for instance, our 8x. We have an open-ender to the nut straight, as well as 2 overcards. And then the weaker straight draws tend to get check called a little bit more often. So you see, for instance, if we have a 9 for the gut shot, I mean, these hands are almost the same, except the difference between the gut shot and the straight draw, and 8x just gets check raised far more often. Since this is a board that in position is not c-betting that much on, we can play tighter with our ace highs. So you see right here, hands like ace jack, ace 10 now just get folded, unless we have the ace of hearts in our hand, because we'll have the backdoor nut flush draw. And the weaker ones like ace 3, ace deuce are now just folds. If we have a pair, a medium strength hand, we just check call like we did in the other examples. This is not a board on which you can really exploit villain by having him overfold unless he over c-bet, as I said. On the other boards, I think it's possible that they undercall hands like, let's say, ace 10 on king 4-3 or 8-5 deuce. Since he's betting this board quite tight to begin with, that argument doesn't really work. Then let's look at one more board category, the good board for imposition. Ace jack 4, I mean, you can't really say anything about that other than the fact that it's just a very good board for imposition. So this is a board on which villains have different strategies, so you're gonna have to study multiple outputs. So a lot of villains bet third pot full range on a board like this, but there's also a lot of villains who mix up their play and have checks as well as big bets. So how do we differentiate between those strategies? So against a full range third pot bet, you'll see that we're check raising a little bit less often now because the board is just not that good for us. Against a full range bet, we're still check raising at a decent frequency, around 14%. This is an under the gun big blind hand, by the way, just for reference, because we are playing against different positions, obviously. So since our range is pretty strong because we defended against under the gun, our range looks like this. So we can check raise this board with most of our strong hands again, but not always. So you have to be a bit more careful. So what about when in position c-bets a tight range? So in position c-bets larger and also checks back around 35%. Now we are check raising a lot less often. So a lot of the close hands are now just folds. So you see, for instance, hands like queen 10 with no backdoors often just gets folded on the flop because in position has so much equity with his strong hands against a hand which only has 3 to 4 outs. You also see that obviously the lower stuff just gets check folded unless we have a flush draw to go with it. So we're mostly calling with an ace, a jack, or a stronger draw. So it's not that difficult to play this strategy on the flop, but on the turn and the river it's going to get much more complicated because villain is going to threaten our stack far more than with the third pot bet strategy. So the flop plays easier, but the turn and the river are going to provide more problems. If we're ever check raising, pocket fours is the hand, right? Because that's our only set. Hands like ace jack gets check raised as well because it's top 2 pair, but we're still check calling a decent amount, especially against the larger sizing, because this is just a board on which we want to be passive in general. We're check raising some of the stronger draws as well. For instance, a hand like king 6 of spades gets check raised quite often. We have a nut flush draw. We also unblock a lot of the hands that villain may be folding or be bet calling and then be folding. And we're generally check calling a bit more often with the weaker draws. A hand like, let's say, 8-6 suited has only an 8-high flush draw and some marginal backdoors. So we don't want to build the pot too much with a hand like that. A quick recap. As you saw, we check raise the flop depolarized versus a high frequency c-bet strategy. And if villain checks back a bit more often, then we obviously decrease our c-bets. And when villain decreases his c-bet range and bets larger, we obviously check raise a bit less often. We're also check calling a lot versus small bets because we're getting great odds and villain often has a marginal hand as well. And we have to adjust to villain's strategy because he may be playing different strategies to the one we studied. It's also important to potentially over check raise on some of the boards he could be overfolding on. For instance, on King 4-3, because he may be undervaluing his ace highs or his backdoor floats. On a board like 7-6-5, that doesn't work as easily because he's c-betting a polarized range to begin with. Now, turn play. What do we do when facing a double barrel? Villain will mostly bet large when betting twice, so we are going to be check raising a little bit less often now. We do a lot of check raising on the flop, but not so much on the turn, unless Villain were to bet really small. But generally when the turn is clean, as you saw in the imposition play video, we tend to bet 3/4 pot or even over pot, so against that really strong range, you don't want to do that much check raising. Villain can check back the flop sometimes, and it's important to have some delay turn check raises. If you don't delay check raise at all, then Villain can exploit you by just always delay c-betting, and worst case scenario, you check call him. So again, he realizes a lot of equity, and he doesn't really have to pot control worrying about the big check raise. And that's also one of the best ways of making the pot really big. And the pot would be way bigger if you check raise the turn for large sizing and then bet river, rather than if you just lead out twice. We generally probe turn with a somewhat polarized range. Again, Villain's strategy is very, very important. I would say that this is one of the most common leaks you say at lower stakes and mid stakes, is that Villains check back very weak ranges in position, so we could exploit them by leading out more frequently and putting a lot of pressure on them. Most villains tend to check back somewhat face-up ranges. So let's say they check back the flop and on the turn a straight draw gets there. Oftentimes they'll just never have that straight, and you can be extremely aggressive when you have that straight, as well as with a lot of your bluffs. Whereas in Pile Solver, you see that he should have checked back the flop with those straight draws sometimes. So make sure to attack those face-up strategies. Obviously, the higher you play, the better your opponents are at mixing up their play, so you can run them over a bit less easily. Let's look at our turn play in Pile Solver. On most turns, Villain will be betting a polarized range. So in the King 4-3 example, I picked a 10 of diamonds. Once he overbets the turn, we don't really want to check raise often. The only hand that is really strong enough to check raise is a hand like King 10, which he also has at a 100% frequency because he always bets the flop. So basically, when Villain bets really big, you could even play a pure check call or check fold strategy. If Villain bets smaller, you absolutely have to include some check raises. For instance, if he were to bet 72 and then 96, now you'll see that we don't check raise often, but we still check raise sometimes. Facing the more common overbet strategy, what are we calling with? Obviously, we're calling with a king because we're just extremely high up in his range and he may be value betting the same hand or even a worse hand occasionally. And then we're mostly calling with hands that unblock his bluffs. For instance, a hand like Ace-3 suited gets called sometimes because we block pocket threes, we block aces, we block ace-king, and we're unblocking a lot of his bluffs. We're also calling our occasional 10x, but obviously we don't have too many of them. And we're mostly folding with the middling hands in our flop check calling range that are now at the bottom of our range. You see, we are check folding 62% of the time because the cardage is so bad for us and Villain bets really big. So forget about minimum defense frequency, that does not hold up in this spot. So what about after we check raise? We pick a 10. And you'll see that on a clean card like a 10, we're mostly betting big. We're actually betting over pot. So guys, if you check raise the flop with a depolarized range, when the turn is, not necessarily, the 10 is not necessarily a great card for you, but it's also not a bad card. It does give some of your backdoors equity. You sometimes hit a pair. So we bet big with a polarized range. So you see we're checking actually over 80% of the time, but when we do bet, we bet really big. On cards that give our range a lot of equity, we can bet more often. On the 5 of clubs, this is extremely aggressive actually. We're betting 95% of the time. Now, I don't think this is really achievable for humans, but you do see that when the card is good for out of position, we keep on betting at a high frequency. That does mean that you have to be facing a good villain who's going to be calling down quite light. If you think that he overfolded a flop and he's not the type to call off a big turn bet with a medium strength hand, then of course you have to be more polarized. But you see that mostly when the board is not scary and the turn is not scary either, we keep on betting with a polarized range. So on most of the middling cards, you'll see that we bet with a polarized range. Again, on the 9, we add some flush draws, some straight draws. We occasionally hit a pair. We check quite often, and then we bet big. On 7-6-5, it works a bit differently. On the queen, you'll see that imposition doesn't overbet that much because it's kind of a scary board for imposition, even when out of position doesn't check raise. So then, since imposition bet's a little bit smaller, similar to the king 4-3 example, we still have some check raises. On this board, we check raise a bit more often because the board is just better for us in general. So what are we check raising? We're mostly check raising hands that were pretty decent on the flop that are now very good. Hands like queen 7, for instance. And we check raise some of the slow plays we had on the flop. So you see that a hand like 8-4 suited was not always being check raised on the flop, so now we check raise on the turn. Because if we never check raise, then villain can make a lot of thin value bets, which we want to prevent. We're calling most of the medium strength hands that unblock bluffs. So you see, for instance, a hand like king 6 gets check called quite often because we unblock a lot of the air in villain's range. We also turn some hands into a bluff, hands like king 8 for instance, that are a little bit too weak to be check calling with, but do have 2 overs and an open ender, so we turn them into a check call, check raise bluff. And obviously we cannot only value raise because then villain can just always fold his bluff catchers. And then we're mostly folding with the hands that block villain's bluffs. On this board, villain's going to check back quite often, so we have to look at turn probing as well. On a bad card like an ace, you'll see that we're checking a lot, which makes sense, right? Because villain just hits a lot of top pairs on this card. So when we bet really big. We're basically saying that we have hands like ace king and ace queen already beat. Now when the card is a bit more neutral, like let's say a6, you see that we now still bet quite large, around 41 into 55, but we stopped overbetting. And we now also bet at a much higher frequency. Before we're betting only 20%, now we're already betting 50%. So you see that on bad cards, we check often and bet big. And on the more neutral cards, we still bet somewhat large, but not huge. And when the card is even more blank, like a deuce, you see that we increase our leading frequency. So which hands do we lead? We mostly lead with our stronger hands and then we check our weaker hands. But obviously we're also trapping. So you see, for instance, a hand like 9-8, we're still checking it around 15% of the time. We're still checking stuff like sets sometimes, because when villain delays c-bets, we still want to have some check raises. We're obviously check calling some medium strength hands as well, in order to not allow villain to win the pot whenever we check. And then we're mostly checking with hands that have some decent high card value, but not the best bluffing equity. So a hand like king queen, for instance, often gets checked down, but then the lower cards, like for instance queen high with the open ender, just get bet, which makes a lot of sense intuitively. On to check raising then. We check raise the flop with a somewhat wide range, and then on the clean card, the deuce, you see that we bet around 3/4 pot. We're a little bit less polarized on other boards because the board is so dynamic. And there's a lot of scary rivers, so we don't want to build the pot quite as much just yet. So we mostly keep on betting with our stronger hands and then with our stronger draws, and then the backdoor hands and the weaker draws we mostly give up with. And then we also have some mergey hands that we can turn into a bluff. Hands like 5-4 suited, for instance, we could have check raised on the flop, and now on the turn we're basically betting for protection against villains' fairly high equity hands, and then at the same time we intend to bluff a lot of runouts. Especially on the heart or on the 9, for instance, where it kind of looks like everything got there. On a worse card, like a king, we have to obviously check a bit more often, because we often don't improve our equity on this card, but villain does. So you see, just in the other examples, when the card is clean, we keep on betting with a polarized range, and then when the card is quite scary, we slow down. If the turn is even more scary, we have to slow down even more. So not only is the king a bad high card, now the flush only got there. You cannot just make the pot huge with hands like 7-6 and 6-5 or even sets anymore, because you could so easily be beat. And even if you're not beat, villain will often have a lot of equity. So we're very uncomfortable putting in money at this point, so we check quite often. When we bet kind of small, so we force villain to call with his medium strength hands. That may not seem very intuitive, but you'll see that Pile Solver uses this type of logic very often. Let's move to Ace-Jack 4. First off, the sim with the full range strategy. So we'll call the flop and we pick the 8 turn. You'll see that in position mostly overbets, also has a few large bets, but under pot. So how do we play against an overbet strategy? You see, we play similarly to the King 4-3-10 board, where we don't really check raise against this very polarized range, and we fold somewhere in the low 60s. We still call all of our aces because we're simply too high up in our range to be folding them, and with most of our aces we'll be unblocking a lot of bluffs. And then we call some hands which are pretty strong and unblock bluffs as well. Call again with a hand like King Jack, for instance, because we block Ace King as well as Jacks, and we unblock most of the middling straight draws. And those are the hands that in position we'll mostly be bluffing with. So you see that hands like Jack 10, for instance, mostly get folded because they not only have a bad kicker, but they also block some of villain's bluffs. So when villain bets over pot on a clean runout, we don't really check raise, and we fold somewhere in the low 60s. You can get away with not check raising at all. I would say that a lot of villains under bluff on these runouts, so you can even get away with being a little bit tighter. What about our check raise turn play? So we check raise the flop, we got called, and we see an 8 turn. You'll see that, again, similar to the King 4-3-10 board, we overbet with a polarized range. Now, however, we bet a little bit more often than on that board because we check raise more polarized to begin with. And remember, we're playing under the gun versus big blind here. So we're just mostly betting with our strong hands as well as our strong draws. And then we have some of the mergey hands, like let's say 5-4 suited, that we can turn into a bluff. So you see, when we have strong equity, like with 10-9 suited, we bet more often than when we have a little bit of equity, like with King-Queen suited, for instance. So if you have bad showdown value but a good draw, it's generally a good hand to be betting with. On a slightly scary card like the King, you see we slow down. We still mostly overbet, but now with a more polarized range because we're afraid of Ace-King. And even Pocket Kings and Queen-10 suited. If villain bets big on the flop, then he probably doesn't bet Pocket Kings, so we would not have to worry about that, but against a full range bet we do. So now we're just a little bit more careful with every hand in our range, with our nutted hands, our pretty good hands, our decent draws, our really good draws. We just tighten up in general. When the flush card gets there, we actually keep on betting very often. We actually bet our full range, and we can pick some kind of medium sizing generally. You don't want to go too big because villain can easily have a flush himself. So how does all of this change when playing versus a mixed strategy? So I pulled up the Ace-Jack 4 mixed strategy sim, and you see that on the 8, when we overbet, we now actually check raise occasionally. So once the pot is so big that villain's stack is being threatened, we start check raising sometimes, but still somewhat infrequently. I mean, we check raise all in about 4% of the time. So with some villains potentially under bluffing, you could again get away with not check raising at all. So you see that the strategy is somewhat similar. We occasionally check raise, get called, and then on the 8 you'll see we're betting a little bit less often, and the reason is because the pot is already really big, which means that our stack is being threatened as well. In this sim, I did not include a 75% pot bet, which may even be best, because then we can keep on betting with a polarized range, but at the same time, it's not that easy for villain to get the money in on the turn because there's simply too much behind. Especially if he plays a bit deeper, it would be very awkward for him because shoving would be a bit too much, but raising small also doesn't really work. And even if that were correct, it's not as if any humans do this. But you do see that we mostly bet for the large sizing unless it threatens our stack. Then we start slowing down a little bit. Quick recap. So when facing a turn barrel for a large sizing, we generally don't check raise much, unless the board is simply very good for us, like for instance on the 7-6-5 queen board. But on the ace-jack-4 board or the king-4-3, for example, we can just get away with not check raising, and we mostly call hands based on hand strength and having good blockers to his value range, as well as unblocking his bluffs. Make sure to not only check weak hands that will check fold or then check all check fold, but also check hands that can check raise. This obviously only matters in spots where villain has a check back range. When probing turns, we are generally somewhat polarized, very polarized in spots in which villain checks back a strong range. But you can often bet a little bit more often than you should because a lot of villains are a little bit face up and capped. So they don't mix up their play enough, so we can respond by being overly aggressive. Now the river. What do we do when facing a river bet? The pot is already going to be very big once villain bets twice, so our stack is at risk. So we generally want to call down hands based on hand strength and blockers, similar to our turn calls, except now our range is much more narrow. So it's actually going to be a little bit easier to navigate your range because your range is narrow, so you can more easily count combos and make sure that your frequencies are not out of check. So it's a good exercise of thinking about your range. Think about how high up you are in terms of absolute hand strength, how high up you are in terms of your blockers. When it goes check check, we should use a combination of block bets as well as big bets. So the block bet is generally used in spots where you have a lot of medium strength hands and where you're starting to run out of bluffs. So you're giving your opponent a good price on a call, which obviously means you cannot be bluffing very often. But since you don't have that many bluffs and you have a lot of medium strength hands which get a little bit more value, the small bet makes sense. And when block betting, I generally recommend something like a third pot sizing. Obviously, we also have good hands on the river that we prefer to bet big. So we'll be picking some kind of bet size that's either around 3/4 pot or even over pot. You obviously have to mix it up. You cannot bet small with all of your weaker hands and then bet big with your better hands, because then you might as well turn your hand face up. So you have to mix it up as well. So let's look at which hands to be trapping with and which hands to just bet for a more straightforward sizing. On King 4-3, let's look at a very clean run out for villain first. You see that he's overbet shoving extremely aggressively for over twice the pot. So in the worst case scenario, when we have to call off our stack to win, which hands are we calling with? So first off, we call based on hand strength. So you see when we have a king with a good kicker, you generally just have to close your eyes and click call. And yes, you have a bluff catcher, unless you have a hand like king queen. But if you fold these types of hands, you're just significantly overfolding, and villain could exploit that by bluffing too aggressively. And then we call down based on our blockers. So obviously if we have ace-3, we would call because we have an occasional trips. And then we call down with, let's say, hands like ace-10. So with ace-10, you're blocking king-10, you're blocking aces, you're blocking 10s, and you unblock all of the straight draws like 5-6, 5-7, jack-9, etc. And then we fold with most of our medium strength hands. Hands like king 5, you see, we can fold because imposition is mostly bluffing with the low straight draws, which we would be blocking. But you see that, for instance, a hand like king deuce does get called because we unblock those straight draws again. So we mostly call with the best kings in our range, and we call with the ones that unblock bluffs. And obviously all the other medium strength hands, like for instance jack 10, queen 10, etc., that we have at very low frequencies, we fold because they're simply too weak and they don't have particularly great blockers. On a slightly worse run out for imposition, he tends to slow down. So then your blockers are not as important anymore. If villain represents basically the nuts or nothing, then blocking value bets can be extremely powerful. But if he represents a very wide range, then your hand strength starts becoming more important. So you see, against a 3/4 pot bet, we still check raise somewhat aggressively. We do have hands like king 10 sometimes and queen jack, which will be check raising. And then we can also turn some hands into a check raise bluff. So which hands do you want to check raise as a bluff on the river? Generally the ones that block villain's best call down hands. So which hands is villain going to be calling down with? Obviously his best hands, sets and straights and 2 pairs. So we want to block all of those. If we had a hand like, let's say, a low straight draw that missed, you don't want to be bluffing with that, because not only do you block some of villain's bluffs, which makes it more likely that he's value betting, you also don't have any blockers to his obvious call downs in sets and straights and 2 pairs. So you see a hand like jack 10, for instance, gets turned into a bluff, a hand like queen 10 as well. So blocking the straight or some kind of relevant pair is very, very important. It's very easy to be overdoing this, so be careful, because you will be representing a very narrow range. So if you start picking all of the offsuit combos, you can be significantly over bluffing. If you think that your opponent is way too tight and he'll only call down with the nuts, then you could be overly aggressive. So make sure to always look at your opponent's strategy when making your decision. So if it's close, look at your opponent. If your hand is an easy fold, fold anyway. If your hand is a clear bluff, always bluff, unless you're playing against a monster fish who just never folds anything, in which case you should just be value betting much more thinly. So what do we do after check raising and betting the turn? We saw that we got a bet with a very, very narrow range. So we did. Imposition doesn't raise that much because the board is somewhat dry and our range is so polarized. So on the blank run out, on the 6, you see we're mostly going all in. If our value range is very narrow, then why would we care about the 6? The 6 does not hurt our hand at all. It's very unlikely villain now has a better 2 pair, for instance, unless he has king 6 when we have king 4 or king 3. So that doesn't really change anything. Pocket 6s will be folded by him on the turn, so he will not river a set. So you see that we bet the majority of our good hands, king 10 for instance, king 3, etc. And then we bluff mostly with the lower bluffs. For instance, a hand that has a 5 or a 7 in it, blocking the straight is very nice to be bluffing with. Or a hand like, for instance, queen 7, which has no showdown value and again blocks the straight. So when you represent a very strong hand, you want to be blocking the hands that you're representing, because then it's less likely that villain is holding those cards and he will often have some kind of medium strength hand that he'll be forced to fold. The 6 is a bit of a dream card though. Let's pick a scarier card. On a scary card like an ace, you see we are significantly less aggressive. So a hand like king 10 for instance is now much less strong on the ace than on a blank. So we can start implementing block bets even with our stronger hands just because they're not worth as much. And then we can occasionally have all-ins because we still have a couple of hands that are good enough to be shoving with. Hands like 5 deuce for instance, 4s, 3s, etc. And then since your value range is much more narrow for your all-in sizing, your bluffing range will also be more narrow. So since we're going all in with an even more polarized range, your blockers to the nuts are even more important now. If we have a hand that doesn't block anything, you may want to choose a smaller sizing. So what about when villain checks behind, which he's going to do at a very high frequency? On a safe card, like a 3, you want to use a combination of block bets as well as large bets. A king is worth a big bet, a 3 as well, obviously. And then we have some middling hands which are a little bit too strong to check, but a little bit too weak to be betting big. So we choose the block bet sizing. We also have a lot of checks, which means that we have to mix it up and also check hands that can check call, as well as check raise. So which hands do we trap with? When trapping and going for the check raise, you generally want to be unblocking villains' stabs. So for instance, if you have an ace with ace 3, you want to check more often, because if he has ace high, he'll be checking behind. But when you block an ace, it's more likely that he either has a bluff, which he would at least bet, so you get a bit of money out of him, or he has some kind of pair. But you see that, for instance, a hand like 6-3 suited gets bet more often, because with the 6 you block some of the straight draws he would have bet with, so it's more likely he has a value hand. You want to be betting with most of your kings sometimes, but occasionally check to check call, and you can even check some hands like king queen to be check raising, because realistically, how are you beat if you have a hand like king queen? Villain would have to have exactly a hand like ace 3 or queen 3 suited, maybe a hand like 5-3 suited to be ahead. And then we're block betting mostly with our medium hands, but we occasionally mix it up. So you see, for instance, a hand like king 10 always gets bet small, because when the 3 beats you and you block a king and you block a 10, it's now pretty difficult for you to get called. So you sometimes want to add some hands that block his calling range into your small bet sizing. A similar example would be like betting small with top set, because if you block two cards that make top pair, what are you getting called by? That, of course, is not relevant in this example because we can never have a set of kings. On a bad card, like an ace, we mostly block bet, which makes sense. Once he checks back the turn, he's going to river a lot of aces. So our value bets are now worth less. We still have a bunch of aces ourselves, so we don't necessarily always need to check. We obviously have some hands that are pretty good, but too weak to be check raising, that we prefer to bet with ourselves. So you see our betting frequency is still quite high, but we now choose a smaller sizing. I also recommend block betting as an exploit because you have to raise very aggressively against block bets. And you'll see that a lot of villains, especially at lower mid stakes, are very scared and they don't raise enough. For instance, if we bet 1/3 pot, you'll see that imposition has to raise around 20% of the time. Whereas a lot of villains, I'm guessing, raise about 5 to 10% of the time. So worst case scenario, you get called and he has a better hand and he wins a small pot. But if he raises and then you have to fold, which was often going to be best, that's a disaster. On 7-6-5, turn queen, villain bet big. And since this is a board that is better for us in general, you saw that we were raising much more often. This is a board which is much better for us than the previous board, which means we'll be check raising much more often against a 3/4 pot bet than on a bad board versus an overbet. We called, and the river is a blank. Obviously, there's not that many blanks out there. So villain bets 3/4 pot, and what are we raising now? We are raising all in with most of our strongest hands, like let's say our good 2 pairs. That obviously only works against villains who are capable of calling down with bluff catchers. If villains under bluff and they don't really bet thinly for value and then also don't call many weaker hands, then you're better off just calling down. So we are check raising our stronger hands, obviously our straights, etc. as well. And then we are turning some hands into a bluff. Hands like 6-4 suited again, for example. 6-4 suited blocks a set and it blocks a straight. And it also unblocks a lot of the higher bluffs that villain will have. And sure, you beat them, but you cannot make a profitable check call with them. Hands like, for instance, big flush draws on our shoes never get bluffed because we'll be blocking some of villain's bluffs. For instance, a hand like ace-8 of hearts is just always being folded. We call down with our medium strength hands, like for instance queen-8, queen-9. We block the straight, we block top pair, we block a set. And if we fold with a good queen, we're simply overfolding again. But if you do think that villains are under bluffing, then you can potentially overfold. The deuce was a bit of a dream card for imposition though. There's not many blanks on this board, so let's pick an 8. Imposition is obviously going to not bet too big and bet with a somewhat polarized range. Obviously we're not folding with a straight, and then we have to call some of our better 2 pairs, as well as again hands that unblock bluffs. But since it's more difficult to find obvious bluffs, we can be a little bit more tight. This is another spot in which villains may underbluff because it's so easy for you to have hit a straight or some kind of 2 pair that he thinks you will not be folding. After having check raised on this board, we bet big on the queen. And what do we do on the dream card, on the deuce? So now you'll be thinking like, wait, I expected us to always bet all in, right? Because we have a polarized range and the deuce changed nothing. The difference is that even though we have tons of obvious value hands, so does imposition. So on king 4-3, there's not a lot of value hands in either players' shoes, but here there are. So that means you want to go smaller. So when everything already gets there, even when you also have those good hands, you want to be more careful. So if this were a 7-6 deuce board, for instance, and then a queen and another, let's say a 3, that would be way different. Then you would be betting big again. But now you have to be a bit more careful. So you see that we're mostly shoving all in with our better bluffs. So the ones that block the straight, for instance, and like 10-8 makes sense. We block 8-9, and we also have 10 high, and we also unblock some of the higher straight draws that villain is forced to fold with. And then we give up with most of our hands like ace-8 of hearts again, because now we block hands that he's forced to fold. And then we block bet with some of our medium strength hands, for instance hands like 7-6, which are not worth an all-in because villain has all the good hands, but at the same time they're a little bit too strong to check with. It also means you have to mix it up and bet small with some of your strongest hands. You see a hand like 8-9, for instance, gets checked occasionally, and it does get bet for the trap sizing around 20% of the time. Against this small sizing, you see that villain has to shove all in very, very often. Again, that may not happen because this feels like a suicide bluff and imposition's shoes. So you can get away with some more block bets exploitatively because villain will not be punishing them. And you can make the same exploit by just check calling, and when it gets checked through, you'll see a lot of block bets because out of position mostly has medium strength hands. A 7 or a 6 or a 5 are potentially worth a small bet, but not a really big bet. So you either want to bet small or big here. And against a small bet, you see that imposition has the raise, not as often as I thought, about 12%, but still, that is quite often. We're also betting big, of course, because we still have some strong hands that we only check called. And we check with some hands that can check raise. For instance, a hand like 8-4 is nice to check raise with. Not only do you have the nuts, but you unblock every pair that potentially bets. A hand like 6-7 blocks 2 pair, so this hand doesn't really work as a check raise because now it's much more likely that villain checks behind and ends the hand. And then we want to bluff with our obvious bad hands, like for instance 10 highs, and maybe some of our occasional lower flush draws, or some of our weaker showdown value hands that we choose to turn into a bluff because otherwise we don't have enough bluffs anymore. So when villain bets small, we're mostly again check raising with hands that block the nuts. So a hand like 8-5 suited blocks pocket 5s. It's one of those hands which is a little bit too weak to call, but since it has potential, you can turn it into a check raise bluff. And you see we can check raise very, very aggressively. And this is a spot in which villain likely has almost no good hands because he doesn't mix it up properly, so you can be a bit overly aggressive. On to the last board texture, Ace-Jack 4. This is by far the worst board for us, given that we only have one set in pocket 4s and a discounted number of top 2 pairs. So imposition overbets the turn, and now we pick the safe river, and you see that imposition is jamming very aggressively. Since he's betting huge, we're getting worse odds on the call, so we have to defend much less. So you see right here, again, we're mostly calling on hand strength. So obviously if we have a hand like an occasional 4, we're calling. If we have a hand like ace queen, we're calling ace jack. We're also calling with some hands that have great blockers. Jack 8, for instance, only has a counterfeit 2 pair, but we are blocking ace jack now, jacks, eights, and we are unblocking every single straight draw. Hands like ace 9, ace 7, ace 6 are not great calls because our hand is not that strong anymore, and also we block obvious bluffs. And then we're folding with our flush draws as well, because not only do they have no hand strength, we're blocking some of his bluffs again. Against a smaller sizing, our blockers are a little bit less important. You see we're now check raising with our strong hands and then again turning some hands into a bluff. You'll see this often in pot limit Omaha. We're check raising with a counterfeit 2 pair because we're blocking villains full houses. So a hand like jack 8 we turn into a bluff, or other hands which block the nuts. Ace 8 also makes sense, as you see right here. And we're calling, and now we're calling a little bit lighter, of course, because we're getting much better pot odds, and our absolute hand strength is now a bit more important than our blockers, because villain is now not only repping the nuts or nothing. So ace queen is mostly a call, ace 10 is a call, and then again we're folding the medium hands which block his bluffs. And you see we're folding much less frequently than against the all-in bet size. On a scary card for imposition like the 9, he's forced to slow down and bet a little bit smaller, and you see we're check raising all in quite often. So we can still have some flushes here, obviously the big flushes mostly, or the ones with a pair. So king queen of spades is never folded on the flop nor turn, obviously, so we check raise all in with those hands. And we'll also have some pairs plus spades that we can check raise all in. And following the trend, we check raise hands that block villain's calling range. When it goes check check, which it will very often, you see that on ace check 4 we're mostly betting large. That makes sense because now an ace is worth a lot, so you want to bet big, and a jack is still probably not worth a bet. So on those other hands, you saw that we mostly have medium strength hands, which we wanted to bet small. But here, an ace is clearly good enough to bet big, and there's nothing else we really want to bet with. So when you're only betting a tight hand selection, which is strong, and not many medium strength hands, and you also have many bluffs, you tend to want to just bet polarized, as you see right here. And then we bet obviously with most of our pretty strong hands, like our top pairs. And then we sometimes check with some nutted hands we can check raise with. So a hand like pocket 3s, for instance, is nice to check raise with because we'll be unblocking all of villain's bet check bets, both as a bluff as well as for value. And then we check raise with hands that block villain's best calls. When we do face a bet, you see we're mostly calling on hand strength this time. So we're never folding with an ace, obviously. We're calling mostly with the better jacks because villain could potentially be value betting them. And we fold most of the middling stuff. On a more scary card like the 10 of spades, our strategy is a bit different. We still have a bunch of very good hands and we'd like to bet big, but now an ace is not a very obvious value bet like it was in the previous hand. So you see that we mostly bet somewhat large with our pretty good hands. It's just a different type of hand strength than it was on the blank run out. If we make the river even scarier, the king of spades, you see we're even more careful. We start block betting more often now. And then obviously we're still overbetting sometimes because we do have a bunch of flushes that would like to overbet, or even hands like queen 10. And then we can turn some hands into a bluff. Generally the weakest hands that we get to this river with, and we prefer to overbet the ones that have good blockers to villain's calling range. So if we have a big spade in our hand, it makes sense to go for the large sizing because we'll be blocking some of the flushes that got there. You also want to bet small with some good hands sometimes in order to not get raised every single time. You see imposition still has to raise around 13% of the time, so we have to add some good hands as well. But since I said that villain likely does not raise enough against our block bets, it makes sense to add fewer traps to the small sizing. But it's important that we still do it sometimes. So make sure to spot all of these patterns. You see, usually on clean runouts, we tend to bet more often and we tend to bet larger. And when a lot of draws get there, we tend to either bet really small or really large, because we're either saying we have a very good hand or we have a very mediocre hand. Not really many in-between hands. So just to recap the river, when facing a river bet, calling again based on hand strength and blockers, and the bigger they bet, the more your blockers matter. And then we mostly fold hands that block villains' bluffs and that are only medium strength. On the river, your range is generally fairly narrow, so it's much more easy to navigate your range than on the turn. So make sure to always think how high up in your range you are when making a call down. Because if you call a hand which you're not supposed to call in theory, villain can exploit you by value betting more thinly and under bluffing. When it goes check, check, make sure to block bet at a high frequency, mostly when you're betting with a lot of medium strength hands. And mostly bet big in spots where you want to be more polarized, because your obvious value bets are worth more and there's also more bluffs in your range. And always make sure to mix it up. We're going to be checking lots of rivers, so it's important to have hands in your checking range that can check raise, so when villain stabs the river, you are not in no man's land. And you can check raise, put him in a tough spot, and make him think twice about value betting a medium strength hand next time. Let's finish the video with some tips. When playing out of position with a wide range, try and keep the pot small. We are out of position, we have a capped and weak range, so try to mostly play passively and keep the pot small, especially until later streets when villain cannot improve his hand anymore. So be very careful not to bloat the pot out of position and do crazy stuff that you have no clue about, and then all of a sudden your stack is being threatened. So as I said, avoid those crazy plays, especially the ones you haven't studied. Check raising and then barreling it off, you just cannot avoid, because that is part of the game tree. And if you don't check raise and then keep betting, villain realizes too much EV on the flop and also on the turn and river. But don't do anything crazy unless you know what you're doing. So it's better to play a very good strategy very well than play a perfect strategy poorly, because in certain spots you may be significantly under bluffing or your bet sizes are off, etc., etc. And this is perhaps the most important tip: do not get discouraged out of position. We are supposed to lose from the big blind. You cannot have a win rate from the big blind unless you're playing in an absurdly soft game. You will lose. Everybody does. OTB Red Baron loses from the big blind. Linus Love loses from the big blind. All top players lose. That's okay. Just make sure to lose the least. So it will feel like you're often getting run over and you're always in these annoying little spots, but that's supposed to happen, okay? So just take that as face value and don't tilt over it. And don't make crazy plays to make up for all the other pots you lost. Just look at every single hand in a vacuum and stay calm and keep the pot small. That was the end of the video. I hope you all learned something. This was MMA Sherlock for the Bluff to Spot High Stakes course. Good luck at the tables.